Amy's here. I'm Amy.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. And today I am in conversation with the lovely Laurie Holmes. And this is a bit of a departure from recent calls, which have been focusing primarily on addiction in support of the now postponed Three Principles and Addiction Conference. So Laurie is a long experienced coach and describes herself as, let me see if I get this right, a laser clarity coach. Is that the right order?
Say it again.
A laser clarity coach.
A laser clarity coach.
Yeah.
Yes.
So so I'm really delighted to be in conversation with Laurie tonight. I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more of her story, and I don't think there's much more that I would want to say in introduction, Laurie. I was lucky enough to enjoy a one-to-one conversation with you recently, which was lovely. And so I'm going to hand it over to you and just invite you to tell us a bit more about yourself, who you are, your backstory to whatever extent you want to go into that, and what it means to you, what that laser clarity coaching means to you. So Laurie Holmes, over to you.
Thank you so much, dear. I have been on this journey probably now for, my math is not great, but let's say 1978. I came into the transformation conversation through the training, Earhart seminar training that was done back in, well, I lived in New York, Long Island, and I had he was my high school sweetheart. He's now passed this last year, very tragically, and I'm so sorry that he's already gone from this earth because he was a really incredible man. But he suffered from both depression, and I think he was also getting Parkinson's disease and passed away in his sleep. And so, beside his wife, and he had a beautiful wife, and she had some children, and they had a lovely life together. But he really did struggle with, even though he understood some things, what he didn't know. And now I'm so glad that I do understand that it's our thinking primarily that creates a misunderstanding of, certain really strong feelings that we have that we think we have to do something about. We have to listen to them. Now, his passing into sleep was not his particular, he wasn't suicide or anything like that, but it does lend itself to really looking at where the source of our experience comes from, so that if we suffer from our thinking or feeling states, that's going to create so much stress and anxiety in our body that, at some point we do succumb to it if it continues. And I saw that with my dad, and saw that with my mom, who was diagnosed bipolar when she was very young. Well, actually, she wasn't diagnosed till later, but she showed up at a very young age, around 10. She was in a family that was very, very smart, but not very wealthy in the monetary sense. And so at 10 years old, she was found stealing things from a little store where she walked with her mom to go get stuff. And the proprietor let her mom know that my mom had taken something, and she did have her return it, but he said, she needs help. And so that understanding of our mental illness, or we didn't see it as mental illness, we saw it as mental illness, that there's something we have to fix and do something about. And that's what I grew up with my whole life, was this misunderstanding about our mental health. And so by the time I was married and separated and coming out of a marriage that had alcoholism and abuse and all that sort of thing, and 2 young boys, I was still caught up in that misunderstanding. I was still caught up in that thinking there was something wrong that needed to be fixed, and scared to death that anyone would find out. Because my biggest fear that somebody would say, "You're just like your mom," which people would say. But I heard it as something different. I heard it as the worst non-compliment somebody could give me. So I went around trying to prove that I was okay, the know-it-all that you can't tell anything to, until Steve, my high school sweetheart, who I was now not in a relationship with because I gotten married and had 2 boys, said, "I want you to do this thing called the S training." And I thought, I didn't get at that point that there was something that I was going to see in it that was going to change my life in any way. I thought maybe I'd get a boyfriend out of it or something like that. So pretty selfish reasons for going. But somewhere in the middle of that training, I got my ass kicked. And when I say I got my ass kicked, it was like a wake-up call to my own story, to the story that I'd kind of the victim story that I'd been running forever since I was a kid and running away from it at the same time. It's like I was telling it and then not wanting anybody to really, look too closely at it, because then they might see something that I didn't want them to see. So it was very confrontive for me. It was really confronting me up against my own misunderstanding or beliefs about the story that I had been telling about who I thought was myself, and the fear that I had that anybody would uncover it and expose me, like I would be exposed as a fraud or as whatever it was I was afraid of at that time. So even when I did something called the danger process inside of EST, we had to stand on a stage, and there was like 20 of us, like a whole row of people went across the stage, and they would say something about each one of us as we were standing there. And I'm 25. And I remember I had my hands in my pockets, and I probably looked like the scared rabbit, and they came to me and they said, "You look like a scared little girl." And that just was like a punch in the belly. It's like, I didn't know that I was so transparent. I didn't know that everything that was going on inside of me was like a neon sign waving for everyone else to see. And so that kind of was the first time it occurred to me that the only one I was fooling was myself. And by the time I got to the end of that training, really, because the punchline through the whole thing was, this is it. We live in the moment, not in the future or in the past. And I lived my entire life up to that point, from all the bad mistakes and decisions I'd made in the past, and the fear that I would just repeat them all in the future. So I could never be comfortable in the moment. The moment was terrifying for me because it wasn't actually the moment. It was my thinking that I was in, not the actual moment of peace and tranquility and quiet. So it took me a few years to really start to see something. And it wasn't until I let go of the S training in the 90s, I'd had enough of having processes. I noticed if I had a process, then there was something to solve or fix, and every time I do a seminar and pay whatever the money was, it never got me anywhere. There wasn't anything that intrinsically that I learned. And I'm like, yeah, this is it, but it was kind of like a so what? It's not really changing anything inside.
It's so interesting. Sorry, I just wanted to say one thing, Laurie, if that's okay, because I did the forum, which was kind of the next generation of EST in the 90s. And even when you were talking about EST, I could feel myself kind of getting uncomfortable, because my fear was that they had a, what was it? They had a name for you, all the kind of stories that you have about yourself. And I don't know whether it was the same in S, but in the forum they called it rackets. And my fear was underneath that there was nothing. You know, that it did, and I was just thinking how different, I know we're getting there, but how different, you know, coming to the principles was. There was something so nourishing about that, so comforting. But anyway, back to you and having enough of S.
Coaching actually came out of that, and that's why I brought it up, because one of the processes we did, as I recall very much, was we all lay on the floor. And we didn't have pillows and blankets and things to make us comfortable unless we had something we could roll up underneath us. And the object of it was that they would walk around. It was almost like a guided meditation that we were all going through. And they started the process by having us kind of go back in time. And I had no idea that I would come up with anything. It's kind of, most of us don't have a very early memory of our childhood. Mm-hmm. But for me, the first thing that popped in was I was born in January of 1953. So I got June 25th, 1953. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Not thinking that I would have anything to recall. It barely 6 months old. But what happened was, all of a sudden, this memory just popped into my mind of me being in a carriage, like like Mom would drive, you know, push the carriage down the street. And
for British viewers, that's a pram.
a pram, a carriage, that's the same thing. But at that point in, I think, pram history, they didn't have a way for me to be secure in the carriage. So I was kind of sliding. Mom was going down a very steep hill, and I'm sliding into the corner of it. So the vantage point I have is squished into the corner and staring up to see this figure above me and I remember seeing the trees, beautiful trees in sunlight, and not really seeing her face very well because it was kind of obscured by the lighting and all that. But I assume it was my mom. And so she's taking me down the hill, and I'm feeling this falling sensation, sliding backward into the corner of this carriage, and then bumping over a curb and falling. Now, I didn't know at that point that any of those images had gone through my life until it dawned on me. Let's see, you don't like pressure on your head. You don't like falling. You don't like going fast or backwards. Yes, I think you did. So it was then that I realized that we carry inside of us feelings or sensations. We may not have words for them at the time before language, but we have the feeling. And the feeling is what creates that kind of bodily sensation of, if you've ever had fallen and that your stomach just drops out from underneath you feeling. Well, that's carried with us. And so I asked my mom, not trying to give her too much information, and she said, well, when you were 6 months old, we lived at the top of this hill in Queens, and I used to take you carriage rides down the hill. I'm like, okie dokie, that was not something I made up. But fast forward to after I let go of the S training and all that, it was probably in 2010-12 period, I decided I wanted to become a coach, because I was getting to the end of being a massage therapist, or so I thought. And I'd already invested since '84, many years into being a massage therapist. And I knew at some point, hello, I've arrived. Mm-hmm. I would want to retire from massage, and what was it that I would like to do? And I thought, well, I'd like to be a relationship coach. So I went about taking an online course first from the International Coach Academy to be a coach. And within that course, I heard something called transformational coaching. And that was like a ding that took me back in time to the S training, but it had a slightly different flavor to it. And so I then said, I'm going to find out who are the coaches in America that are doing very well. And I stumbled across, Jamie Smart and Michael Neal, and eventually the three principals. And my biggest insight came after being in one of Michael Neal's courses that took place over a weekend. And it was like 5 a.m. for me and 10 a.m. for them, but I think it started around 4. And I had my first iPad, I'll never forget it. And I'm in bed because they can't see us. The type they had back then was you were just a participant. They didn't see you in the room. So you could be naked and they wouldn't know it for all the 9 people who are listening. Luckily, I did have something on. But I was very, very, like barely awake because it's not my time to be up. And this was my first experience of anything online. And I remember that I was kind of coming into the last one of 4 in a series. And so I had absolutely no idea what I jumped into, other than I'd read Michael Neal's Coaching 101 book. And that was kind of like, oh, this stuff sounds so familiar. It was like that good feeling you have when you come home. And so while I was listening in on this training, and meanwhile, everybody, all I see is their backs and then the presenters in the front of the room. And that was Michael Neal, Jamie Smart, Aaron Turner, and Allie Campbell, a great group of men, fabulous. And I remember bits and pieces of whatever they shared. And I remember that Michael Neal made me laugh hysterically. I said, for that alone, I would pay to do a training with him. He was so funny. And then Jamie Smart was very matter of fact. Like if you ever met Jamie or been around Jamie or trained with Jamie, he's kind of like that. But he's funny, but in a very different kind of way to Michael Neal. But anyway, so there I was in this training. And it wasn't until close to the last day that one of the guys that was in the training had gone out for lunch, and he had talked to a couple of homeless men on the street and paid them to listen to him for an hour and a half, which I thought was pretty remarkable. Let me pay you to listen to me for the next 90 minutes. And one of the men couldn't speak. He had been for years just totally like a mute and unable to say anything because whatever he tried to say didn't make sense anyway. And at the end of, I'll say, Martin's talk, because it was Martin, this guy got up, laughed, said in perfect English, I got it, I made it all up, and off he went. And I was just gobsmacked at my home. It's like something landed there that I hadn't realized had gone through until I woke up the next morning. And this was Sunday, and Monday I woke up, and for the first time, Christian, I woke up into a completely quiet mind. It was incredible. It was so serene. I didn't know what that felt like. I didn't know what it felt like to have peace inside of me. I had lived in such a chaotic, crazy thinking mind, anxious and fearful and all that stuff, that to have it totally silent was like the best gift anyone could have given me. And that lasted for 4 days. Now, why is that important to why I'm a laser coach? Because I was starting to connect the dots in time about how our minds work and how the somatic memories get stored in our tissue. And when I started doing these trainings with both Michael Neal and Jamie Smart, I had conversations with other coaches. And I realized that there was something that was still not working for a lot of people. And what I saw was there was a connection between that the mind could understand on an intellectual level how the mind worked, from an inside out, but they didn't understand it from a sensation level. That was the place that I call it the missing link to the difference between the intellect and the spiritual. Because if you don't see that your feelings were created at a moment in time when you were vulnerable and scared and upset, and that thought that you had, whether it was a verbal thought or a felt thought like I had at 6 months old, that thought or energy is now continuing through time and is creating your behavior in the future or the now. And I kept having these conversations when I was in school with mentee, because I was a mentor, mentee after mentee, and I kept coming up against the same wall. What is it that they're not seeing? And that's where the laser coaching was formed. Because as I directed them back in time to see what was causing this, everything about the principles makes sense except for here. Now, you and I both know that there are no exceptions. So if there's an exception, there has to be a misunderstanding, right? And so I got curious and I thought, well, I actually know this process. Why don't I give it a try and just see what happens? And person after person after person I worked with, once we got back to that core belief, that core moment when that feeling was created, and the misunderstanding always, without exception, looked like the feeling was coming from something outside of them. Something someone did, something someone said, an event that occurred. It always looked like that feeling was because of what that person said or did or what happened. It was never from the child's point of view coming from their thinking, ever. And yes, the smart rats will say, well, it was my thinking. And I'd say, you don't know that. At 3 years old, you didn't know that. At 3 years old, it looked like what mom did, said, or whatever, or dad didn't do, or sibling, blah, 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 or incident. And so once they see through that, once that connection's made to see that they never, ever, ever had anything happen except that was inside their own mind, and it was never coming from outside of them. It was like this entire incident looked different. They could innocently see how they misunderstood it. They could innocently see how they decided how somebody else felt, or because of their behavior, that they, mom didn't love me because she didn't come and change my diapers when I was 2, or mom wasn't listening to me because I was outside and I was calling and she ignored me. I'm just making up stuff. But these are some of the things that I've heard. And it could be that innocent. It could be that innocent that baby, child, or young person innocently misunderstood where their experience was coming from because nobody knew. They didn't know to tell them that. The children today are growing up knowing this, which is fabulous. What better way for children to start to understand than to be told at those ages how their minds work? They're getting that information now. They're getting to see the truth now, but they didn't get it then. And almost everyone I work with, doesn't matter how long they've been in the principles either, Christian, it doesn't matter. They can have been around 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, 2 years. If they have a misunderstanding about something going on in their life right now, that comes from a core belief that they had when they were a baby. Every single one goes back to that without exception. And the minute they see through it, that thread, all those threads, those tangible threads that weave, that you created, starts to dissolve. And that's pretty miraculous, as far as I can tell.
So you have a different, you know, there's a slightly different take than that I might have, because it seems to me that just as we're thought in the moment is always what's creating my experience, thought in this moment. But thought is, so it can include beliefs I've picked up about myself, false beliefs that I've picked up about myself, but it's only present when that's being engaged with consciously or unconsciously. And so maybe it's another way of saying the same thing. And because what has occurred to me, an insight I had, is that even if I have a belief about something about myself, you know, I'm just trying to think of something, but like I'm shy. I don't think that like I'm shy, every time I seem to do something that fulfills that false belief, or that, you know, that operant belief about myself, it's actually subtly different. You know, just as a recurring dream or a recurring nightmare, each time's a fresh creation, but it's colored by sort of deeper beliefs that, or in the case of nightmare, you know, a deeper and more constant thing. And I think of another example of that is like accents. We learn accents. That's, you know, the process of learning. I mean, we learn them automatically, but they, but there's, each time we speak, it's similar but not identical. So yeah, it's just that there's something in there for me that I think I have a slightly, because it doesn't, the thing about the being stored in the body isn't how I see it, but it's always the operation of thought, which of course is far vaster than what we know we're thinking.
It's not stored technically there.
Right.
If somebody says, I have this feeling in my chest, if I were to open up your chest, we're not going to find it. It's not
right. So that is just a thought-created association as well. Yeah.
It's a memory creation. It's not real.
Yeah.
Nothing's real. But when you're listening to it and you're feeling it, the key here is it feels real.
Yeah.
It feels like it's true. So if you believe something to be true, it's going to stick around. And it doesn't matter how it shows up. It can show up differently at different times, but the root of it, that belief, that core belief root, came from that very innocent misunderstanding in childhood. They all go back to that moment when the child thought something that was true, and often about themselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes about a parent or a friend or a child or another child or whatever it was. And so when they see that that was created in that moment, because that's what made sense then, but it's no longer applicable when you're 54 years old. Okay, it's no longer true. It wasn't really true then. How could it possibly be true now? If you had an incident when you were 4 that you somehow decided meant you were shy, who knows what happened? I'm just making this up, right? And maybe you learned a word later called shy, and that fit with how you felt. Oh yeah, I can't really talk to anybody. I'm so shy. Whatever that was, right? We make up a lot of stuff when we're kids. We're very inventive. Our minds are extremely creative. But in that moment when you were shy because you couldn't do whatever it was the other kids were doing, and you couldn't go out inside and play because you couldn't, be around other kids, that decision that you made about being shy may have been true and may not have been true. It just depended on the viewpoint that you had about it at that time, right? And it may have only been applicable in that particular situation. But that didn't mean you were shy. It just meant you had shy thinking. Mm-hmm. It's like being anxious. You're not an anxious person. You're just having anxious thoughts. Mm-hmm. We make that as if it applies to everything. It's as if everything is coming from that point of view. When that's not the truth, and it never was. That was just how you were seeing it in that particular moment in time made sense to that 4-year-old. But how does it make sense now to a 54-year-old who goes, I'm shy? Why? Where did that come from? Who made that true? And is it? And that's what I ask people. Is that still true? Because if you can come up with one time when you were not shy, then it negates the whole thing. Because in order for something to be true, it has to be true for everyone. That's what a principle is, right? It has to be true for everyone under all circumstances and all ways. It can't only be true here, not true there. You can't be shy here and not shy there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you're up for questions, Laurie, and if any of the people who've joined us
or if anybody wants to ask a question, please, feel free. I don't know if they can be brought in or how you want to do this, or you're going to just
people can unmute themselves, or if they're more. Oops, Nikki's coming in. I see, Nikki.
Hey. I was just going to comment on the things being stored in the body because I have read an author, I think it's Judith Blackstone. She has done work on trauma, and she says that trauma is stored in the fascia in the body. The memories of it and that there are literally body postures that people who've had trauma get locked into. And that rang true for me as I've had trauma that I noticed. She talked about it manifesting in the posture. And when I came to see that and understand that, I was always worried about my posture. But just that understanding shifted my posture. It was pretty weird. So I guess there is, I don't know the science of it. I know I experienced that and it made sense to me. And I don't know, Laurie, if you have any validity to that, given your massage therapy practice of seeing that there might be patterns of belief that impact different body areas.
Well, this is how I'll say it. So we know that thought and feeling are the same, are opposite sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. I will go back to say that a somatic memory is still a thought, even if it shows up in a body part. Because I've had stuff in my belly since I was a kid, and now I've had diverticulitis. So it has a real manifestation now as an illness that has been an ongoing thing with me, probably stress related, that I've just put it all into my body, and I've been doing it since I was a very little child. I mean, mine goes back to 6 months old, for crying out loud, and 2. So yeah, I've definitely stored in my, but when I say stored, physically stored, mentally stored, I believe they're part of the same mechanism. I don't think they're separate. I don't think you can separate them. because what can show up and manifest itself as cancer, per se, could have its roots in a belief or a thought that you had when you were very young. So I do think that the body will finally show up as that manifestation. If you keep doing it long and long enough, it will show up as illness. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? So if you were, let's using the idea of posture for a minute, if you've been told since you were a very young kid that you were a nobody, you were never going to amount to anything, you were useless, do you think you would walk with a very high posture, wide open, or would you be somebody that would be more like this?
Are you asking me or the group?
It
was protecting the heart, I think, is part of what it was. And I'm not saying it's perfect. It just was the consciousness of that connection immediately shifted my capacity to straighten my posture. Like I knew I had posture. I just couldn't seem to open up or sustain an open posture. And then when I had that insight of, oh, no wonder this is this burden of trauma that I've never recognized, that experience, it was like a shift. I'm not saying I still don't become aware that I'm slouching or self-protecting or whatever, but
I think it's all part of that same thing, that the
Mm-hmm.
mind-body connection, the how we think it and feel it is what is creating our reality, right? And so if your mind is saying something to your body about being useless and worthless and whatever like that, your body is going to emanate that. It's going to show up that way. There are plenty of children out there that have lived pretty ferocious lives, and yet their inner being was glowing so strongly that they could stand up tall and they could not let those thoughts or feelings connect with, they were showing up differently than the way that they had been taught. And so I do think that they are combined. I think it's part of the whole thing. Once we can see the truth, and you saw the truth, then you didn't have to behave that way anymore. You didn't have to have that posture anymore. You could see something different and showed that. It's beautiful.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Nikki, for the question. Thanks, Laurie. Anybody else want to come in at the moment? Any other question? Oh, Sonia, I'll unmute you. Oh.
Same time, I think, Christian. So, thanks very much, Laurie, for that opening. But apologies for being a little bit late. I was actually on another call, so and then I struggled to find the link, but I got there in the end. So, so I've got kind of two parts to my question for you. One is, how do you take or help clients find these core moments or know that these are core moments? So that's the first part. And secondly, when you find that core moment, how do you share that core moment was actually thought in the moment and not the circumstance?
Those are great questions. So what I typically do is I start with the feeling first. Sometimes people have they might have something that they believe about themselves that we can start with. But usually I begin with do you have a repeating sensation in your body that's been going with you through your whole life? Like you feel something typically it runs from the belly to the neck. Occasionally, sometimes it's the head or around the shoulders, but mostly it's a sensation that's repeating for people and they feel it in their body somewhere. And so once we have a strong enough sensation, then we follow the sensation back in time to the earliest memory that might pop up around that sensation. So in other words, if you said, oh, I always have this feeling in my chest, for instance, and I might say, well, what does that feel like? And I've heard things like heavy or heavy cloak or, like weird, butterfly sensation or whatever it may be. That if we can get a really clear picture of what that feels like, then we can do an eyes closed process, kind of almost like guided meditation, if you want to call it that, because I don't know what else to describe it as. And then the body or the mind just takes us back to the earliest memory. And sometimes a older memory will pop up. And I don't know how to explain it to you, but I just know when we're not there that that's not it. And I can usually tell by the way the person reacts to the memory that we've gotten really close. And the more reactive they are to the memory, like usually it brings up sadness for most people, not always, but mostly. When the child shows up in that moment. I'm no longer talking to the adult. I'm now talking to the child in that memory, in that moment, with whatever's going on, because it's very significant and very real to them in that moment. And they describe what happens. And sometimes it's a clear memory, and sometimes it's just a piece of the memory. But we're looking at it I'm looking at it very objectively, very lovingly, very supportive, just trying to understand from their mind what are they seeing and what are they feeling, what seems true and real to them. And once we have uncovered that, and usually again, I can feel when that's happening. I can feel when we've reached the core. It's hard to describe how I know it. I just do. And sometimes people don't get there, and sometimes they stay intellectual, and it's okay. They're not ready to go there yet. That's fine. Or people have very sketchy memories, and we have to kind of piece it out based on what they can remember or what they are feeling. And then once that's clear, and they may be in a very emotional moment, I then pull them back out, lovingly pull them back to the present moment. And I say, okay, now let's look at this logically, because we're in the child's mind, we're not in a logical place. We're in a feeling place, we're in an emotional place. So from that place, they're not very subjective, they're not very neutral. So they can't really decide or understand why they're feeling that way. But once we see where those feelings are actually coming from, in the adult mind, not the child's mind, we look and see, is that really true that your mom can give you that feeling, or that incident could make you feel that way? So we look at it logically. Is that really true? Is that possible? And once it becomes clear that it was never true and it was never possible, that it was coming from outside, that usually triggers a release. They see through it. And once you know that that was never true, that creates a dissolving of that situation. And oftentimes I will say, well, how does it feel now in your chest or in your belly or in your throat? And if they really had a pop, it's gone. They didn't have a pop, there's still something there that they're usually not willing to release yet, which is fine. And that usually takes us to another conversation, which I've had at least, 4 to 6 conversations with people, and we keep unraveling more, because as one thread gets unraveled, the next thing shows up, and then that goes back and that gets unraveled. I was just thinking, if you could think of all the little things that happened to you when you were a kid, and all the decisions that you might have made from those things that happened, and all the misunderstandings that you might have had given that, there's just some that have lingered because you can't tell that they were created in the first place to protect you in that moment. but they were never true. And that's the key, to get that they were never true. Is that?
Yeah, that definitely gives me an insight as to how that works for you. If I was to ask you sort of an average, how long does that process take? But also, it's the second part I'm interested in, is the how they get to know the truth of that when they've been so caught up in what they thought was a reality, that it was created by the person or the circumstance.
Well, that's okay. Number one, ask the first question again. Sorry.
So it's the second part. So the bit about how long does it take to get through that process? And then secondly, when you, as you're doing that process, that bit about helping them understand the truth, that how do you get them to see that? That's the bit I'm interested in.
Yeah. So it varies individually. I've had it pop in 30 minutes. I've had it pop in an hour and a half. So laser coaching for me means it usually is pretty quick. And I've seen quite a lot of change occur in 30 to 45 minutes. Occasionally with somebody that is very into their head and very intellectual about it, and it doesn't pop and it doesn't pop, and we've tried this and that and the other, then I know that there's something that they're not, I hate to say it this way, but it's just something there that they aren't willing to keep, to go in there that deep. And that's okay. I don't want to make it that there's any right way or wrong way to do this, because everybody comes to it differently. I've just noticed with the ones where it has popped, it usually creates laughter and lightness, and the feeling goes away. And then the insights start coming in for days and days after. So those are the ones that I would say that they really got to that core. How do I know it's the core? Is that your next question? Basically, and again, I don't know how to describe this to you very well, but I'll just say that I'm very intuitive because I've been doing this for over 40 years in one form or another. I know when we've gotten to the truth. I can feel it and they can feel it. When they're in the very midst of the feeling, however, I do not do anything in that place because they can't hear it there. That's why I pull them back out and I talk to the adult and we look at it logically, because it's with logic in the mind that we can see what the emotion will not reveal, if that makes any sense. Because when you're in the most emotional part of it, you aren't going to be listening very much to whatever I say. So I have to pull you out of there. I have to pull you back to the present moment. And I have to ask the adult, not the child, what makes sense given the child's point of view. Because the child didn't understand in that moment that that wasn't the truth of their experience. That was just how they were seeing it in that moment. Made sense to them. If mom didn't come and pick me up from the crib and I had soiled diapers, I probably wouldn't have decided anything at that age other than a feeling, because I may not have had words to describe what that was like. But that feeling was around every time mom did or didn't do what she did, so it got cemented every time. And so as that feeling continued through time around anything similar, that would keep making that feeling accurate, if that makes sense. And so later on, it could look like something totally unrelated to diapers, right? Or mom not coming and picking me up, but it could look like I must not be very important. Why don't people listen to me? And it all goes back to mom not listening because I was crying in the crib with dirty diapers. So you see how things get linked innocently? And it's not a fault of mom or the child. It's just a misunderstanding. Mom might have been busy in that moment or thought, oh, she's fine. I just changed her diapers, you know, whatever ago. She can wait a few more minutes. She was busy. Who knows what she was up to? The child doesn't know that. They just know the sensation that they're feeling in that moment. And that's what feels real to them. And that's what stays in the body. That's what carries through with us. And then it just keeps changing form depending on what's happening that keeps triggering it, right? So that by the time you're 40 or 50 or 60, it can look like, well, nobody wants to listen to anything I have to say. And yet you had no idea where that came from. Now, is that really true? Is that true all the time, that nobody wants to listen to what you have to say? I'm making that up, but you see what I'm saying? And so if we can find one time when that wasn't true, well, why are you still thinking that then? Why are you still believing that to be true? Why is that still running your life? It doesn't make sense, does it? So that's how we look at it. We look for the sense in it. Does it make sense to continue to think that way? Given da 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 da. Does that make more sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Laurie. Thank you.
Thank you for asking all the questions.
Thanks, Sonia, and thanks again, Laurie. We've possibly got time for one more briefly. I don't know if anybody else has a question or a comment or anything they'd like to share. And if not, nobody's rushing to do that right now, Laurie. So I was going to ask you something. And you touched on something that you, in your working with people when they perhaps identify a memory and the beliefs that they've kind of bought into innocently and automatically from that you bring them back, and you I can't remember what you said, you bring them back gently or in a nurturing way. And I mean, it's very clear to me from the conversations that we've had and knowing you that there's something different about you than that est or forum thing. But yeah, I see that Michael's raised his hand, so I'm going to I'll just finish the question and then go over to Michael, and maybe the answers will come together. But it was something about, it's been very important for me, that sense of safeness and nurturing, and that that you're not left, that you're not left in a situation that without my story I'm nothing. So perhaps we could let that one stick to the wall, and I'm going to go just unmute Michael and invite you to come in, Michael.
Thanks, Christian.
Hey.
Hi, everyone. Laurie, I'm a bit confused in regards to how you seem to combine what you call the logical and the three principles. Because of when we try to be rational or stay rational, it seems that we actually move away from consciousness and into something ego-based. The way I see it, the way I understand it, sort of like a personal perspective of stuff. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think when I say logical, I'm looking at it as truth. I should maybe say truth, not logic. But when I look for the truth of something, the truth is something that's always true, no matter how we think or feel about it, right?
Good.
The principle is truth, right? And that the mind works only one way, from the inside out, correct? Okay. and that it's spiritual. It's a spiritual thing, not a intellectual thing. So we're having a spiritual conversation, not an intellectual one. But when we're talking to a child that has created something that they believe is true, they're not in a spiritual conversation in that moment. They're in an intellectual conversation because they're looking at it through the logic of their own self in that moment. They're looking at it, if I'm crying and mom doesn't come and get me, therefore I'm not important. I'm making this up. This is just an example, okay? So it's like you put 2 and 2 together and you come up with 4, right? That's logical in a child's mind. If I'm asking for something and I'm not getting it, therefore, da 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 da. If I'm crying and nobody comes to take care of me, therefore, da 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 da. And it looks like the responsibility is on the person that's not fulfilling what the child wants, right? Yep.
Okay, so you mean, so in the conclusion that we make as children.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but that's not necessarily true. It's only true in the way that the child put it together, how it looked to them.
In that moment, yeah. Okay.
And exactly. But that moment was a key factor in them deciding, if anybody does this to me again, that keeps making that true. If you keep doing this, then that makes that true. So that feeling just intensifies through time because now that shows up every single time that happens. Like I use the analogy of Pavlov's dog, right? Ding, dog salivates for food. Same thing. Child has da-da-da happen because da-da-da-da was involved. Therefore, if anything like that happens again, and I feel that same way, therefore this, and that's what I mean by the logic of the situation. That's the child's logic. That's the way it looked to them. Doesn't mean it was true. It just means that that's what it made sense to them in that moment. Now, does it make sense to a 54-year-old if I explain it back to them that way? No, because they see the truth of it very quickly. But in the mind of that child that they have in their head, they're not seeing it from the logic of a 54-year-old. They're seeing it from the memory and the feeling of the 4-year-old. That's what's being remembered. That's what's being felt all the way through time. And I don't care what you give me as an example of something you're struggling with right now. It has its core root in childhood. I've seen it happen with procrastination. I've seen it happen with time. I've seen it happen with money. I've seen it happen with I'm not good enough, or I'm shy, or fill in the blank. It doesn't matter what you come up with. Every single one of those that has a feeling associated with it goes back to a moment in time when you decided that was true. I've not had one exception yet. And there's nothing wrong with that unless it's getting in your way now. Unless
so the holding on to something that went on way back.
Yeah.
As a child, you could be 24 as a child, or you could have a child's mind at 32.
Exactly.
Yeah,
but
okay.
Because it's acting out of that core belief, and they're not 24, they're 3.
Yeah. Even though if it happens as 24, they react as if they were 3.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. I see it. Yeah.
Does that make more sense then?
Oh yeah. It was just about the logic. They used to, when you use the word logic and 3 principles in the same sentence, it does make sense. So thanks.
But my point is to take them back to where did that feeling come from?
Yeah.
Where did that initial feeling come from?
Yeah.
And every single case, the feeling looked like it came from outside. So if you really understand the principles, is that true? Is that possible?
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Yeah. Thank you very much for asking the question.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Laurie. I'm conscious that we have just about run out of time. Can I just hand it back to you for a couple of moments, Laurie? And obviously you've spoken that you do work with people. I'll put your contact details in the notes to the recording on YouTube, and it's already on the event details. But can I just hand it back to you to sort of finish us off tonight, as it were?
And thank you for giving me this time. It's been beautiful. And I just wanted to let everyone know that was in this group who has never had a chance to work with me, that I love having these conversations. They're free unless you decide you want to go further. But the first conversation could last anywhere from 45 minutes. It's gone as long as an hour and a half. But I would love to have a conversation with anybody who would love to spend the time with me. And just, you can contact me through whatever Christian has set up, and I will be glad to set something up with you very soon. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It's been beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.